All right, the next topic is looking at geologic processes and California's geologic past. So we discussed geologic time and how we're in the Phanerozoic in the last 541 million years. Before that, California was mostly, what is now California was mostly underwater. And again, remember, we can break up this eon into the Paleozoic, which is generally before the dinosaurs, the Mesozoic, the period of the dinosaurs, and the more recent Cenozoic, since the extinction of the dinosaurs. All right, so the Paleozoic, before the dinosaur era, the hundreds of million years ago, most of the California is still underwater. There's some little bits of it over on the very eastern, southeastern edge that are being formed, but there are geologic processes happening underwater because of subduction. If we move into the Mesozoic era, the era of the dinosaurs, those geologic processes of subduction are creating mountain ranges that we know, that the early mountain ranges that are we know today. So this is a period called the Nevadan orogeny, where the Sierra Nevadas are being built up because of subduction. We also have plutons forming. Magma underneath the ground is solidifying into what's called a batholith. And again, the Sierra Nevada is created from a massive batholith. So here we have subduction taking place. The early California at one time, what's this now seen, the Sierra Nevada was the coast of California. And just inward, we had subduction happening, and we had volcanic processes, volcanoes on the top, and plutons at the bottom, big chunks of rock being formed underneath the ground. We also had accretion happening, or material being dragged along the edge of California, and this would later become what is now the Coast Range of California. Now, we call this the Franciscan complex along the edge. This is something called melange. This is sedimentary and igneous material that's been crushed against the continent, forming an outer layer. Okay, now we're in the more recent Cenozoic era, past the dinosaurs, which is about the last 65 to 70 million years. And most of what we see around California is things that are happened during the Cenozoic era. There's more evidence of that because as geologic processes happen, it tends to cover up things that happened in the past. So much of what we see in modern day California are things that have happened fairly recently. One feature includes what's called Cenozoic basins, like the Great Central Valley, which filled up with sediments over time. At one time, it was underneath the water, but as material kind of flooded into this basin, it built up over time and became now what's the Great Central Valley. Another thing that happened in the Cenozoic of significance is the evolution of the San Andreas Fault. So at one time, you had subduction all along California, but what was called the Phaleron Plate at one time eventually was overran by the North American Plate. The North American Plate kind of creeped and creeped and creeped until it was covering up that subduction zone. And at that time, you had a transition to where the Pacific Plate is now in contact with the North American Plate and is slowly moving northward. So we moved from a subduction zone. There's still a piece of that up here where you do have subduction along the Juan de Fuca Plate, to now where you have what's called a transform plate boundary, where the San Andreas is moving, where part of California is moving along the San Andreas northward, where part of it is slowly kind of creeping downward. And the San Andreas Fault helped to create the coast ranges. You had folding and faulting happening as this area is creeping northward. One other result is the exposure of what are called marine tissues. So along coastal California, you can sometimes find these uplifted areas of former seafloor. And another thing that happens is that the Central Valley is slowly being cut off from the ocean. In the Sierra Nevada, you have faulting on the east side that causes the eastern Sierra Nevada to rise. So on the Sierra Nevada, on the Central Valley side, it's very gentle slope, and on the east side, it's a very sharp slope. You also had the extension or pulling of the area behind the Sierra Nevada, which caused the basin and range area. You have tensional forces creating what are called horse and grabens. The Central Valley is what's called a downward valley. So being squeezed between these coast ranges in the Sierra Nevada, this is kind of pulled the valley downward. And as it did, it slowly filled with sediments, or what we call alluvium, from Sierra Nevada and from the coast ranges.